The forest stretched endlessly before us, a sea of emerald shadows that seemed to ripple in the windless air. It had been my idea to venture into the heart of Brackenridge Forest, a place whispered about in local legends but never officially mapped. For us, a group of self-proclaimed adventurers with a shared thirst for the unexplored, it seemed like the perfect challenge. The group was small. Julia, with her encyclopedic knowledge of wildlife. Mark, always carrying enough gear for an army. And Rachel, whose infectious energy could buoy any flagging spirit. I, of course, was the planner, the one who marked out the route, double-checked the supplies, and convinced everyone that Brackenridge's legends were just stories. The hike began innocently enough, the trail weaving through sunlit clearings dotted with wildflowers. Birds chirped in a symphony of life, and the scent of pine needles filled the crisp air. Yet as the hours wore on, the forest seemed to close in, the trees growing denser and the sunlight fading to an uneasy twilight. "Feels different here, doesn't it?" Julia said, breaking the silence that had fallen over us. She was trailing slightly behind, her gaze darting to the darkened canopy above. Mark shrugged, his oversized pack clinking with every step. "It's just thicker woods, nothing weird about it." Rachel chimed in, her voice bright but tinged with unease. "I don't know. It feels a little quiet. No birds, no bugs, nothing." She was right. The once vibrant forest had gone still, the absence of sound pressing against us like a held breath. Even the crunch of leaves underfoot seemed muted, as though the forest were swallowing the noise. We pushed on, our conversations growing sparse as unease settled over us. When the sun dipped below the horizon, I called for us to set up camp in a small clearing. It was while Mark was setting up the fire that Julia spotted it. "Hey, come look at this," she called, crouching by a tangle of roots near the edge of the clearing. We gathered around her, peering at the object she had unearthed, a small metallic disc half buried in the soil. It was intricately carved with patterns that seemed to shimmer as the firelight danced over it, though it was impossible to tell if it was made of stone, metal, or something else entirely. "What is it?" Rachel asked, her voice hushed as though afraid of being overheard. "Looks ancient," Julia murmured, brushing away more dirt. Mark leaned in, his flashlight beam reflecting off its surface. "Might be a piece of old machinery, or art. Hard to tell." I reached out hesitantly, my fingers brushing against the cool, smooth surface. A faint pulse, almost imperceptible, seemed to emanate from it, like a heartbeat. That night, as we sat around the campfire, the artifact rested between us. None of us could explain its allure, nor could we shake the feeling that it was watching us. When I finally lay down in my tent, I couldn't sleep. The forest seemed alive with whispers, rustling leaves, and faint sounds that might have been footsteps. But no one was there. The following morning brought little comfort. A thick mist clung to the ground, muffling sound and turning the forest into an endless expanse of gray. As we packed up the campsite, Rachel pointed toward the artifact. "Did anyone move it last night?" I followed her gaze. The artifact, which we'd left beside the fire pit, was now several feet away, half hidden under a patch of moss. "No one touched it," I said, though the words felt hollow. Julia crouched beside it, her expression tense. "Maybe an animal?" "What kind of animal moves a rock like that?" Mark cut in, his tone sharp. The forest offered no answers. We continued on, the mist thickening with each step. The trees now loomed impossibly tall, their twisted branches creating strange shapes against the dim light. The path, once so clear, had vanished entirely, leaving us to rely on my compass. Or so I thought. "Why does it keep spinning?" I muttered, holding the compass up for the others to see. The needle whirled in lazy circles, refusing to settle. Rachel frowned. Maybe it's broken? It was fine yesterday, I snapped, more out of fear than frustration. Mark checked his GPS, then swore under his breath. Nothing, no signal. For the first time, the word lost felt like more than an exaggeration. The unease from the day before returned with a vengeance. The forest seemed to breathe, the mist curling around us like smoke. Shadows danced just beyond the edges of our vision, fleeting and insubstantial. By the time we found another clearing, the light was fading fast. We set up camp in silence, the artifact now buried in Julia's pack. That night, the whispers returned. They started faintly, barely audible over the crackling fire. At first I thought it was the wind, but then the murmurs grew distinct, words I couldn't quite make out. Rachel sat bolt upright. "Did you hear that?" We all nodded. The fire sputtered, the flames shrinking as though snuffed by an unseen force. The shadows grew darker, denser, pooling around us like ink. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the trees. Nothing moved. And yet, the feeling of being watched was undeniable. Morning came, but the light brought no comfort. The mist had thickened overnight, clinging to the forest floor like a living thing. Sunlight filtered weakly through the dense canopy, casting everything in a sickly gray hue. We packed our gear quickly, eager to move, though none of us could say where we were going. My compass was useless, its needle spinning wildly. Julia's map, crumpled and damp, showed trails that no longer seemed to exist. "What's the plan, fearless leader?" Mark asked, though his usual sarcasm was gone, replaced by a quiet dread. I hesitated, staring at the trees that surrounded us. They felt closer now, their trunks twisted and gnarled, as if contorted by some unseen force. "We keep moving. We'll find a way out." Rachel glanced over her shoulder, her eyes darting to the forest's shifting shadows. What if there isn't a way out? No one answered. We walked in silence, our steps muffled by the damp earth. Time lost meaning as the forest stretched endlessly in every direction, an oppressive labyrinth of trees and mist. The artifact, still tucked away in Julia's pack, seemed to weigh on us like a curse. By midday, our nerves were fraying. Julia stopped abruptly, pulling off her pack and rummaging through it. "I can't. This thing," she stammered, yanking the artifact free and holding it up for us to see. Its glow had intensified, the intricate carvings shimmering with an otherworldly light. The patterns shifted before our eyes, forming symbols that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. "Does anyone else feel that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I did. A faint vibration pulsed through the air, a rhythmic thrum that seemed to emanate from the artifact itself. It wasn't sound exactly. It was deeper than that, resonating in my chest and making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Put it away," Mark said sharply, his voice cracking. "Just put it back." Julia hesitated, her fingers trembling as she shoved the artifact into her pack. But the air didn't settle. If anything, it grew heavier, thicker, as though the forest itself was watching us. It was late afternoon when we realized we were walking in circles. Rachel was the first to notice. "Look," she said, pointing to a cluster of moss-covered rocks. "We passed those hours ago." Mark scowled. "That's not possible. We've been heading in a straight line." "Then explain this," Rachel shot back, her voice rising with panic. The argument fizzled as a low hum echoed through the trees, soft at first, but growing steadily louder. It was faintly musical, like the sound of wind blowing through a hollow reed, yet wrong in a way I couldn't describe. "What is that?" Julia whispered, clutching her pack like a lifeline. "I don't know," I admitted, my pulse quickening. "But we need to keep moving." As dusk settled over the forest, the hum grew louder, joined by faint whispers that seemed to come from the shadows. They weren't words exactly, just fragments of sound, rising and falling in a way that set my teeth on edge. We reached another clearing just as the last light faded, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. The artifact, now glowing faintly through Julia's pack, seemed to pulse in time with the whispers. Mark crouched near the fire pit, his hands trembling as he struck a match. "We can't stay here," he muttered. "Where else are we supposed to go?" Rachel snapped, hugging her knees to her chest. No one had an answer. The fire sputtered weakly, its flames barely illuminating the clearing. We huddled close, the artifact resting between us like an unwelcome guest. Julia spoke first, her voice barely audible over the crackling wood. "I think we've disturbed something." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. "This forest, the artifact, it's not random. It's like it's alive." Mark snorted, though his laugh was hollow. "You're saying the forest is keeping us here? That's insane." "Is it?" Rachel whispered, her gaze fixed on the shadows beyond the firelight. "Look around. Nothing about this place is normal." As if to punctuate her words, the fire flickered violently, casting long, spindly shadows across the clearing. One of them moved. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow stretched unnaturally, detaching itself from the others and slithering across the ground like a living thing. "Did you see that?" Rachel gasped, her voice trembling. We all did. More shadows began to move, slipping through the trees and pooling at the edges of the clearing. They had no shape, no substance, yet their presence was undeniable. A writhing mass of darkness that seemed to breathe and pulse with a life of its own. The whispers grew louder, taking on a rhythmic chant that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't understand the words, but their meaning was clear. We didn't belong here. Mark grabbed a stick from the fire, holding it out like a weapon. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice was laced with fear. The shadows didn't stop. Instead, they coalesced into a single figure, a towering humanoid form with elongated limbs and eyes like empty voids. It stood at the edge of the clearing, watching us with a stillness that was more unsettling than movement. The artifact pulsed brighter, its glow casting eerie patterns across the ground. Julia clutched it tightly, her knuckles white. "What do we do?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know. The figure stepped forward, its movements unnaturally fluid. The air grew colder, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. And then it stopped, its gaze fixed on the artifact. The air was thick, heavy with an unnatural cold that sank into my skin and settled deep in my bones. The figure loomed at the edge of the firelight, its towering form wavering like a mirage. Its hollow eyes fixated on the artifact, clutched in Julia's hands, the glow of the relic reflecting in the dark voids where its face should have been. No one moved. Even the fire seemed paralyzed, its flames frozen in a surreal stillness. The whispers, once faint and scattered, grew louder, forming an eerie harmony that echoed through the clearing. They weren't coming from the shadowy figure. They were coming from everywhere. The trees, the ground, the very air around us. "It's watching the artifact," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "It wants it." Julia's grip tightened, her knuckles white against the artifact's shimmering surface. "If we give it this thing, maybe it'll let us go. Or maybe it'll keep us here forever," Mark countered, his voice raw with fear. The shadow took a single step forward, its elongated limbs moving with an unnatural grace. It raised a spindly hand, pointing directly at Julia. The artifact responded. Its glow pulsed brighter, casting sharp, angular shadows across the clearing. The hum that had vibrated in the background all day intensified, resonating deep in my chest like the rumble of distant thunder. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice shaking. "We have to leave. Now." "Go where?" Rachel asked, her eyes darting to the encroaching shadows. There's no way out. I didn't have an answer. The fire flickered violently, the shadows closing in. The figure at the clearing's edge remained motionless, its hollow eyes locked on the artifact. Julia took a step back, clutching the relic to her chest. It's drawing them to us. The artifact. It's the reason we're trapped here. She was right. The air around the artifact shimmered, distorting like heat waves rising from asphalt. It was more than a relic. It was alive, a beacon calling out to the forest and the entities within it. Then get rid of it, Mark said, his voice rising in panic. Throw it into the trees. Bury it. I don't care. Just get rid of it. Julia hesitated, her gaze shifting between us and the artifact. What if that makes things worse? What if it's the only thing keeping them from... She trailed off, but we all understood. From what? We didn't want to find out. The shadowy figure tilted its head as if it had understood her hesitation. It extended its arm further, the gesture slow and deliberate. I started, my voice hoarse. I think it's offering us a choice. The whispers rose into a cacophony, the chanting relentless, drilling into my skull. I could feel the forest watching, waiting. Julia stepped forward, her hands trembling as she extended the artifact toward the figure. Its glow intensified, bathing the clearing in an otherworldly light. The shadows recoiled slightly, as though the light pained them. The figure didn't move. Its empty gaze locked on Julia, unblinking, unyielding. "Take it," she cried, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. "You can have it. Just let us go." For a moment, nothing happened. The forest held its breath, the whispers falling silent. Then the artifact floated from Julia's hands, as if drawn by an invisible force. It hovered in midair, its light pulsating faster and faster until it became a blinding golden beacon. The shadowy figure raised both arms, and the artifact dissolved into 1,000 shimmering fragments, scattering like fireflies into the darkness. The clearing erupted with light. It wasn't the warm golden glow of the artifact. It was a cold silvery light that seemed to seep into every shadow, illuminating the forest in sharp, stark detail. The trees, so ominous in the mist, now looked ancient and skeletal, their branches clawing at the sky. The shadowy figure dissolved into the light, its form unraveling like smoke caught in a wind. The oppressive weight that had hung over the forest lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. We stood in silence, our breaths visible in the frosty air. The fire had gone out, leaving only the fading glow of the artifact's remnants to light the clearing. "Is it over?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. We left the clearing without speaking, our steps cautious as we retraced our path. For the first time in what felt like days, the forest seemed normal. The mist had thinned, revealing patches of moonlit sky. The compass in my hand no longer spun aimlessly, its needle pointing steadily north. By dawn, we found the trailhead. When we emerged from the forest, blinking in the harsh morning light, it felt like waking from a nightmare. The artifact was gone, and with it, the strange presence that had haunted us. Yet as we parted ways, each of us knew the truth. We hadn't escaped unscathed. The shadows of Brackenridge still lingered in my mind, their whispers echoing in the quiet moments. The forest had let us go, but its secrets remained, buried beneath its ancient canopy. And sometimes when the wind blows just right, I can still hear the hum,